Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The humid Manila air clung to Manny Pacquiao's skin as he stepped out of his black sedan at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport. His usually confident stride carried a subtle hesitation this morning, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by his security detail. The boxing legend's calloused hands, which had delivered thunderous punches to opponents across the globe, now trembled slightly as he clutched a formal invitation that had arrived at his General Santos City home just 3 days prior. The letter bore an official seal he didn't immediately recognize, but the weight of its words had kept him awake for 2 consecutive nights. An invitation to speak at the African Union's Youth Leadership Summit in Ouagadougou, specifically requested by President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The young African leader, barely in his 30s, had specifically asked for Manny's presence, citing his journey from poverty to global recognition as an inspiration for African youth facing similar struggles. Manny's mind drifted back to his conversation with Jinky 3 nights ago when the invitation first arrived. She had found him sitting quietly in their garden, the letter resting on his lap, his eyes distant and contemplative. Without saying a word, she knew something profound was stirring within her husband's heart. The same look had crossed his face when he decided to enter politics, when he chose to build schools in impoverished communities, when he established his foundation to help street children. The flight to Burkina Faso would be long, giving him nearly 20 hours to process what this invitation truly meant. As he walked through the airport's VIP lounge, Manny reflected on the research his assistant Carlo had compiled about Ibrahim Traoré. The African president had come to power through extraordinary circumstances, leading his country through a period of significant transformation. Like Manny, Traoré had risen from humble beginnings, understanding the weight of responsibility that comes with representing the hopes of an entire generation. Boarding the aircraft, Manny settled into his seat and opened the folder containing more detailed information about the summit. The theme centered on overcoming adversity and creating opportunities for the next generation. As he read through the agenda, he noticed his own story would be shared alongside testimonies from other global figures who had transformed their circumstances through determination and faith. The airplane's engines hummed to life, and Manny closed his eyes, allowing his mind to wander back to his childhood in Kibawe, Bukidnon. He remembered the corrugated metal roof that leaked during monsoon seasons, the single light bulb that illuminated their entire home, and his mother Dionysia's worried expressions when there wasn't enough food on the table. Those memories, still vivid after decades, had shaped every decision he'd made since achieving success. As the plane ascended above the Philippine archipelago, Manny wondered what stories Ibrahim Traoré might share. The briefing materials mentioned the African leader's background, but Manny sensed there were deeper narratives waiting to be discovered. Something about this young president's reputation for speaking truth to power, for challenging conventional thinking, and for inspiring hope in seemingly impossible situations resonated deeply with his own experiences. The invitation had mentioned a private meeting before the main summit, an opportunity for the 2 leaders to share their perspectives on leadership, responsibility, and the burden of carrying their people's dreams. Manny had accepted immediately, though he couldn't fully explain why. Perhaps it was the sincerity in the written request, or maybe it was his own curiosity about what wisdom this young African leader might possess. Looking out the airplane window at the clouds below, Manny felt an unfamiliar mixture of anticipation and vulnerability. Throughout his boxing career, he had faced the world's greatest fighters, but this journey felt different. This wasn't about physical combat or proving his strength in a ring. This was about something deeper, more personal, and potentially more transformative than any championship belt he had ever won. The scorching African sun greeted Manny Pacquiao as he descended the aircraft stairs at Ouagadougou Airport. The dry heat immediately contrasted with the tropical humidity he had left behind in Manila, but there was something invigorating about this new environment. The reddish soil beneath his feet seemed to pulse with an energy he had never experienced before, and the sight of local children pressed against the airport fence, waving enthusiastically despite not knowing who he was, stirred something deep within his chest. His security detail, led by his longtime bodyguard Angelo, moved efficiently around him, but Manny found himself slowing down, absorbing every detail of his surroundings. The architecture was different here, the sounds carried different rhythms, and even the quality of light seemed to tell stories of resilience and hope. As they walked toward the waiting convoy, he noticed how the airport workers moved with purpose and dignity, their eyes bright with the same determination he had seen in the faces of Filipino laborers back home. The drive through Ouagadougou revealed a city in transformation. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, while traditional markets bustled alongside modern buildings. Manny watched through the tinted windows as vendors arranged colorful fabrics. Children played soccer with makeshift balls, and elderly men gathered under baobab trees, their animated conversations suggesting the weight of important decisions being discussed. The parallels to his own country were striking, yet everything here carried its own unique cultural fingerprint. His accommodation at the luxury hotel felt almost inappropriate given the context of his visit. As he settled into the presidential suite, Manny found himself drawn to the balcony overlooking the city. The afternoon call to prayer echoed across the urban landscape, mixing harmoniously with the sounds of daily commerce and the laughter of children playing in distant courtyards. This symphony of life reminded him of the complex tapestry of sounds that had filled his childhood neighborhoods in General Santos City. The briefing materials about tomorrow's meeting lay spread across the mahogany desk, but Manny's attention kept drifting to the view outside. His research team had compiled extensive information about Ibrahim Traoré's background, his rise to leadership, and his vision for Burkina Faso's future. The young president's reputation for straight talk and unwavering commitment to his people's welfare had earned him respect across Africa and beyond, but Manny sensed there were deeper layers to discover. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and his assistant Carlo entered with the final schedule adjustments. The private meeting with President Traoré had been moved up to early evening, allowing for a longer, more intimate conversation before the formal summit activities began. This change sent an unexpected flutter of nervousness through Manny's stomach, a sensation he hadn't felt since his early professional boxing matches. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Manny prepared for what he somehow knew would be a life-changing encounter. He chose his most humble attire, understanding instinctively that this meeting required authenticity rather than ceremonial grandeur. The weight of representing not just himself, but the hopes and dreams of millions of Filipinos who saw him as their champion settled heavily on his shoulders. Standing before the mirror, Manny saw beyond his own reflection to the countless faces of people who had supported him throughout his journey. His mother Dionysia's weathered hands, Jinky's encouraging smile, his children's trusting eyes, and the faces of countless fans who had found hope in his story. Tomorrow's conversation would somehow connect these personal relationships to something larger, something that transcended borders and cultures. The evening air carried the scent of grilled meat and spices from street vendors below, mixing with the sounds of music and conversation that seemed to flow like a river through the city streets. As Manny prepared to leave for the presidential palace, he felt an unusual combination of humility and anticipation, knowing that whatever words Ibrahim Traoré would share would somehow reshape his understanding of leadership, purpose, and the true meaning of serving others. The presidential palace of Burkina Faso stood majestically against the darkening sky as Manny Pacquiao's convoy approached the main gates. The building's architecture reflected a harmonious blend of traditional African design and modern governance, with its warm sandstone walls and elegant archways, creating an atmosphere of both accessibility and dignity. Security personnel moved with quiet efficiency, their respectful demeanor suggesting this was a place where serious conversations about the future regularly took place. As Manny stepped from his vehicle, he was struck by the absence of excessive pomp and ceremony. Unlike many presidential residences he had visited throughout his political career, this place emanated a sense of purposeful simplicity. The gardens surrounding the entrance featured indigenous plants and trees, their natural beauty requiring no artificial enhancement. Even the lighting was subdued, creating an environment conducive to meaningful dialogue rather than theatrical display. An aide escorted him through corridors lined with artwork, celebrating Burkinabe culture and history. The paintings and sculptures told stories of struggle, triumph, and the enduring spirit of a people who had faced numerous challenges throughout their journey toward independence and self-determination. Manny found himself slowing his pace, absorbing the visual narratives that seemed to mirror his own country's complex relationship with colonial history and the ongoing pursuit of authentic leadership. The waiting area outside the president's office was furnished with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, rather than the formal rows typical of government buildings. This subtle detail spoke volumes about Ibrahim Traoré's approach to leadership, suggesting conversations rather than lectures, dialogue rather than monologue. Fresh flowers in simple vases added touches of natural beauty without ostentation, while books on African philosophy and economic development sat openly on side tables. When the office doors finally opened, Mani's first glimpse of President Ibrahim Traoré immediately challenged his expectations. The young leader's presence filled the room not through physical imposing stature, but through an unmistakable aura of quiet confidence and deep thoughtfulness. His handshake was firm but gentle, his eyes direct but kind, and his overall demeanor suggested someone who carried the weight of his responsibilities with both humility and unwavering determination. The president's office itself continued the theme of purposeful simplicity. A large wooden desk dominated one corner, covered with documents and reports that clearly received regular attention. Maps of Burkina Faso and the broader African continent covered one wall, marked with notations that suggested active engagement with regional development projects. Family photographs occupied a small shelf, humanizing the space and reminding visitors that leadership decisions ultimately impact real people's lives. As they settled into comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows overlooking the city, Mani felt an unusual sense of calm descending over him. The view revealed Ouagadougou's evening lights beginning to twinkle, each one representing families, businesses, and dreams that depended on wise leadership and sound decision-making. This perspective seemed to embody the enormous responsibility both men carried as public figures whose choices rippled through millions of lives. President Traoré's manner of speaking immediately captivated Mani's attention. His voice carried a unique combination of intellectual depth and emotional authenticity that seemed to cut through conventional diplomatic pleasantries. There was something in his tone that suggested he had personally experienced the struggles he spoke about, that his understanding of poverty, injustice, and the hunger for dignity came from lived experience rather than academic study. The conversation began with customary exchanges about their respective countries and the challenges facing developing nations in the modern world. However, Mani quickly sensed that this dialogue would venture far beyond typical diplomatic discourse. Ibrahim Traoré's questions about his boxing career, his transition to politics, and his ongoing humanitarian work demonstrated a level of preparation and genuine interest that surprised him. As the evening progressed, Mani found himself sharing stories and perspectives he rarely discussed in public forums. The president's ability to listen with complete attention, to ask probing questions that revealed deeper truths, and to respond with insights that connected personal experiences to broader human struggles created an atmosphere of extraordinary intellectual and emotional intimacy. The conversation deepened as the night settled over Ouagadougou, and Mani found himself experiencing something he had never encountered in decades of meetings with world leaders, politicians, and dignitaries. Ibrahim Traoré's words carried a weight that seemed to bypass his analytical mind and speak directly to his soul. The young president's insights about leadership, sacrifice, and the true meaning of serving one's people began to unravel assumptions Mani had held for years about his own journey and purpose. As Traoré shared his perspective on what it meant to carry the hopes of an entire nation, Mani felt something shifting inside his chest. The African leader's understanding of poverty wasn't theoretical or political, it was visceral, personal, and achingly real. When he described the responsibility of representing those who had no voice, who lived in circumstances that most people couldn't imagine, his words seemed to illuminate corners of Mani's own experience that he had never fully examined. The president's articulation of leadership as a form of sacred trust began to resonate with memories Mani had buried beneath years of public appearances and political responsibilities. Images of his childhood poverty flashed through his mind. His mother's calloused hands from washing other people's clothes, the nights when dinner consisted of rice and salt, the shame of wearing the same clothes to school day after day. These weren't just personal hardships anymore. They were the foundation of an unspoken covenant with every person who saw him as their champion. Traoré's description of the loneliness that comes with leadership struck Manny with unexpected force. The African president spoke about the weight of making decisions that would affect millions, about the isolation that comes when you realize that your choices carry consequences far beyond your own life. He described sleepless nights spent wrestling with the knowledge that somewhere, families were depending on your wisdom, your integrity, your ability to choose correctly when the path forward wasn't clear. As the president continued, his words began to paint a picture of leadership that Manny had never heard articulated so precisely. It wasn't about power, prestige, or personal achievement. It wasn't about being celebrated or remembered. True leadership, according to Traoré, was about becoming a bridge between the suffering of your people and the possibility of their redemption. It was about transforming your own pain into a pathway for others to find hope. The emotional intensity of these concepts began to overwhelm Manny's composure. Throughout his boxing career, he had learned to compartmentalize emotions, to maintain focus under pressure, to present strength even when feeling vulnerable. But Ibrahim Traoré's words were dismantling these defenses with surgical precision, revealing truths about his own journey that he had never fully acknowledged. The president's insight into the burden of representation particularly affected him. Traoré explained how every public appearance, every decision, every word spoken in public carried the weight of millions of dreams and aspirations. People didn't just see you as an individual, they saw you as the embodiment of their own possibilities. This realization had always existed somewhere in Manny's consciousness, but hearing it articulated with such clarity and depth made it feel overwhelming. As Traoré spoke about the necessity of remaining humble while carrying extraordinary responsibility, Manny began to understand why this conversation felt so different from any he had experienced before. The African leader wasn't speaking from political talking points or carefully crafted public messaging. He was sharing truths that could only come from someone who had genuinely wrestled with the profound implications of leadership and emerged with a deeper understanding of what service actually meant. The weight of these revelations began to accumulate in Manny's chest like a physical presence. His breathing became slightly irregular, and he found himself fighting back emotions that threatened to surface despite his years of training in maintaining public composure. Ibrahim Traoré's words were doing something that no opponent in any boxing ring had ever accomplished. They were breaking down his emotional defenses completely. The silence that followed Ibrahim Traoré's most profound observation hung in the air like a sacred pause, as if the universe itself was allowing time for his words to fully penetrate Manny's consciousness. The African president had just articulated something about the relationship between personal suffering and universal service that cut through every defense mechanism Manny had developed over decades of public life. The concept was so clear, so devastatingly accurate, that it felt like someone had just explained the purpose of his entire existence in terms he had never heard before. Traoré's description of how personal pain becomes the foundation for healing others. Wounds resonated with a frequency that seemed to vibrate through every cell in Manny's body. The president had spoken about transformation not as an abstract concept, but as a living reality where individual suffering becomes the raw material for collective hope. This wasn't philosophical theory. It was a precise diagnosis of how broken people become instruments of restoration for other broken people. The emotional dam that Manny had carefully constructed throughout years of maintaining public composure began to develop hairline cracks. His throat tightened involuntarily, and he felt a trembling sensation starting in his hands and spreading up his arms. The professional boxer who had faced the world's most dangerous opponents without flinching found himself completely defenseless against the power of words that spoke directly to his soul's deepest chambers. Ibrahim Traoré's insight into the sacred nature of carrying other people's dreams struck Manny with the force of a physical blow. The president explained how every person who had ever looked up to him, every child who had seen possibility in his story, every family that had found hope through his success, had essentially entrusted him with their most precious possession, their belief that life could be different. This wasn't just about boxing victories or political achievements, it was about becoming a living testament to the possibility of transformation. The weight of this realization began to overwhelm Manny's emotional equilibrium. Memories flooded his consciousness. The faces of street children in Manila who had approached him with eyes full of desperate hope, the elderly women in remote provinces who had cried upon seeing him, the fathers who had whispered blessings in his ear while their children watched with amazement. Each of these encounters suddenly revealed itself as a sacred trust, a covenant he had entered into without fully understanding its profound implications. Traoré's words about the loneliness of carrying such responsibility created an ache in Mani's chest that felt almost unbearable. The African leader described how true leaders often feel like bridges spanning impossible distances, strong enough to support others, crossing but unable to find rest on either side. This metaphor captured something about Mani's own experience that he had never been able to articulate, a sense of existing in the space between his humble origins and his elevated position, belonging fully to neither world while serving both. As the president continued speaking about the courage required to remain vulnerable while wielding power, Mani felt the first tears forming in his eyes. The emotional barriers he had maintained for decades were crumbling under the weight of truths he had never heard expressed with such clarity and compassion. His breathing became irregular, and he found himself struggling to maintain the composure that had served him throughout countless public appearances. The moment of complete emotional surrender approached like an inevitable tide. Ibrahim Traoré's words had accomplished something that no physical opponent, no political adversary, no life challenge had ever achieved. They had reached the most protected part of Mani's heart and spoken directly to the vulnerable child who still lived there, the boy who had once been hungry and scared and hopeful all at the same time. The African president's final observation about the divine responsibility of leadership pushed Mani beyond his breaking point. The tears that had been threatening to fall now flowed freely, and his shoulders began to shake with the force of emotions that could no longer be contained. The breakdown arrived with the unstoppable force of a dam, finally giving way after years of mounting pressure. Manny Pacquiao, the man who had stood victorious in boxing rings around the world, who had faced down political opponents without wavering, who had carried the hopes of an entire nation on his shoulders for decades, now sat completely shattered by the power of words that had reached the most protected corners of his soul. The tears flowed without restraint, each one carrying years of suppressed emotion, unspoken fears, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility he had never fully acknowledged. His powerful hands, which had delivered knockout punches to world champions, now shook uncontrollably as they covered his face in a futile attempt to contain the flood of raw emotion. The composed public figure disappeared entirely, replaced by a vulnerable human being confronting truths too profound to process without complete emotional surrender. Ibrahim Traoré's response to this moment revealed the depth of his own understanding of leadership's burden. Rather than offering conventional comfort or attempting to minimize the emotional intensity, the African president simply remained present, his own eyes reflecting the weight of recognition. He understood that this breakdown wasn't weakness, it was the natural response of a sincere heart, finally comprehending the full magnitude of what it meant to serve others. The sobs that racked Mani's body seemed to release decades of accumulated pressure. Every sacrifice he had made, every moment of loneliness despite being surrounded by crowds, every decision that had kept him awake at night, every instance when he had wondered if he was worthy of the trust placed in him, all of these experiences poured out in waves of uncontrollable emotion. The physical act of crying became a form of liberation, freeing him from the prison of composure he had constructed around his true feelings. Through his tears, memories cascaded through Mani's consciousness with startling clarity. He saw his mother Dionysia's face during those early years when poverty defined every aspect of their existence, her eyes reflecting both pride and worry as his boxing career began. He remembered Jinky's unwavering support during moments when he doubted his ability to carry the expectations placed upon him. The faces of his children appeared in his mind, innocent and trusting, depending on him not just as a father, but as a symbol of possibility. The emotional release continued as Mani confronted the loneliness that Traoré had identified so precisely. Despite being surrounded by advisors, family members, and millions of supporters, there had always been an isolating aspect to his position. The weight of making decisions that affected others, the pressure of representing hope for people he would never meet, the responsibility of living up to an image that sometimes felt impossible to maintain, these burdens had created a form of existential solitude he had never been able to share with anyone. Ibrahim Traoré's presence during this vulnerable moment felt like a form of sanctuary. The African president's own understanding of leadership's psychological toll created a space where complete emotional honesty was not only acceptable, but necessary. There was no judgment in his eyes, no discomfort with the intensity of Mani's breakdown, only the recognition of one leader witnessing another's moment of profound truth. The physical intensity of the crying gradually gave way to a different kind of emotional experience. As the immediate flood of tears subsided, Mani felt something shifting within his chest, as if space was being created for new understanding to take root. The words that had triggered this breakdown continued to reverberate through his consciousness, but now they felt less like devastating revelations and more like illuminating truths that would reshape how he understood his role in the world. The silence that eventually settled over the room carried a sacred quality, as if both men understood they had witnessed something transformative. Mani's breakdown hadn't diminished him. It had revealed the authentic depth of his commitment to serving others and the genuine nature of his concern for those who looked to him for inspiration and hope. The gradual return to emotional equilibrium felt like emerging from deep underwater, with each breath bringing Mani back to the surface of consciousness where rational thought could once again function alongside the overwhelming feelings that had just consumed him. His eyes, still wet with tears, began to focus on the gentle patterns of light dancing across the office walls as the evening settled into night. The profound vulnerability he had just experienced left him feeling simultaneously drained and strangely energized, as if some essential truth about his existence had finally been acknowledged. Ibrahim Traoré's continued presence provided an anchor of stability during this delicate transition. The African president's understanding of what had just occurred was evident in his patient silence and the respectful way he maintained space for Mani to process the emotional earthquake that had just rearranged his internal landscape. There was something deeply healing about being witnessed in such complete vulnerability by someone who clearly understood the unique pressures of leadership and the psychological toll of carrying other people's hopes. As his breathing steadied, Mani began to experience a clarity of thought that felt different from anything he had ever encountered. The emotional breakdown had somehow cleared away layers of accumulated assumptions and defensive mechanisms, leaving him with a raw honesty about his own motivations and fears. The words that had triggered his tears continued to echo through his mind, but now they felt less like devastating revelations and more like keys unlocking chambers of understanding he hadn't known existed. The realization that his entire journey, from the poverty of his childhood through his boxing triumphs to his political career, had been unconsciously guided by a desire to prove that transformation was possible, struck him with renewed force. But Traoré's insights had revealed that this wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about becoming a living demonstration that circumstances don't define destiny, that hope can survive even in the most desperate situations. This understanding brought with it a profound sense of responsibility that was both humbling and empowering. Every decision he had made, every risk he had taken, every moment of doubt he had overcome had contributed to a narrative that extended far beyond his individual life. People he would never meet had found courage in his story, had discovered reasons to continue fighting their own battles, because they had seen evidence that victory was possible. The weight of carrying such symbolic significance had always felt heavy, but now Mani understood it differently. Instead of a burden imposed from outside, he began to recognize it as a sacred trust, voluntarily accepted through his choices and actions. The breakdown had revealed that his discomfort with this responsibility came not from its difficulty, but from his previous inability to fully comprehend its profound meaning. Ibrahim Traoré's wisdom about the loneliness of leadership took on new dimensions as Mani reflected on his own experience. The isolation he had sometimes felt wasn't a personal failing or an unfortunate side effect of success. It was an inherent aspect of occupying a position where your individual choices ripple through thousands or millions of other lives. Understanding this didn't eliminate the loneliness, but it transformed it from a source of pain into a badge of authentic service. The conversation that had precipitated his emotional breakdown now revealed itself as one of the most important experiences of his adult life. Traoré's ability to articulate truths that Mani had felt but never been able to express had created a bridge between his intuitive understanding of his role and his intellectual comprehension of its implications. This integration felt like a form of internal healing, connecting parts of himself that had previously operated in isolation. As the immediate intensity of his emotional response continued to subside, Manny found himself experiencing a deep gratitude for this unexpected encounter. The young African president had offered him something no advisor or counselor or friend had ever been able to provide, a mirror in which he could see the true nature of his calling clearly reflected. The final moments of the evening in Ibrahim Traoré's office carried a weight that seemed to slow time itself, as if the universe recognized the significance of what had transpired between these two leaders. As Manny prepared to leave, he understood that he was no longer the same person who had arrived hours earlier. The emotional breakdown and subsequent revelations had fundamentally altered his understanding of his role in the world, his relationship with his own story, and the profound responsibility that came with being a symbol of hope for millions of people. The handshake they shared before parting felt like the sealing of an unspoken covenant between kindred spirits who had recognized something essential in each other. Ibrahim Traoré's words continued to reverberate through Manny's consciousness, but now they felt like permanent installations in his mental landscape rather than temporary insights. The phrase that would stay with him forever had been simple yet devastating in its clarity. The idea that true leadership meant becoming a bridge built from your own transformed pain, strong enough to support others, journey from despair to possibility. The drive back to his hotel passed in contemplative silence, with Manny staring out at the sleeping city of Ouagadougou while processing the magnitude of what he had experienced. Streetlights illuminated small glimpses of life continuing in homes and businesses, each one representing individual stories of struggle and hope that now felt personally connected to his own journey. The abstract concept of serving others had been replaced by a visceral understanding of what it meant to carry the dreams of people he would never meet, but whose lives had somehow become intertwined with his own. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams that seemed to weave together images from his childhood in the Philippines with scenes from his evening with Traoré. In these nocturnal visions, he saw himself not as a famous boxer or politician, but as a bridge spanning the distance between poverty and possibility, between despair and hope, between what is and what could be. The metaphor that had triggered his emotional breakdown now appeared in his dreams as a living reality, with countless people crossing safely from one side of their circumstances to another. The flight back to Manila provided 20 hours of uninterrupted reflection time, during which Manny found himself mentally revisiting every significant moment of his life through the lens of understanding that Traoré had provided. His early boxing victories took on new meaning as he recognized them not just as personal achievements, but as public demonstrations that transformation was possible. His political career revealed itself as an extension of this same mission, an attempt to create systemic changes that could provide others with the opportunities he had fought to create for himself. Landing in the Philippines felt like returning to a familiar place with completely new eyes. The faces in the airport, the sounds of Tagalog conversations, the humid tropical air, everything felt simultaneously unchanged and profoundly different. Manny understood that the transformation had occurred within him, not in his external circumstances, but this internal shift would necessarily affect every interaction and decision moving forward. The reunion with Jinky and his children at their General Santos City home carried an emotional intensity that surprised even him. As he embraced his family, he found himself seeing them not just as the people he loved most, but as living embodiments of the possibilities he had been fighting to protect and expand throughout his entire career. Their smiles, their trust, their unquestioning faith in his ability to navigate the complexities of public life now felt like sacred responsibilities rather than simple family relationships. In the days that followed, Manny found himself unable to articulate to others exactly what had occurred during his meeting with Ibrahim Traoré. When asked about the encounter, he could only say that he had never heard anything like it, that the African president had somehow managed to explain the purpose of his entire life in terms that made perfect sense while simultaneously revealing how little he had previously understood about his own journey. The words that had broken him down so completely now served as the foundation for a renewed sense of purpose that would guide every decision he made for the rest of his life. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.